Caught my husband and my best friend's wife plotting against us. Now I'm questioning everything. I always trusted my husband, Chris, and my best friend, Alyssa. The two of them had been constants in my life for years. Chris and I had been married for 7 years, and Alyssa and I had been inseparable since college. She was practically family. Her husband, Jake, was a quieter presence in our lives, but he was solid, loyal, kind, and always supportive of Alyssa. The four of us often spent weekends together, sharing meals and stories. We were the kind of group that people said, "You're lucky to have each other." But that illusion came crashing down one random Tuesday night. Chris had been acting strange for weeks. He was always on his phone, claiming it was work stuff, but his body language was off. He'd tilt the screen away when I walked into the room, or he'd step outside to take calls. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Work had been stressful for him lately, and I didn't want to add to it by accusing him of something without proof. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Then one night, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Alyssa. "Alyssa, we need to meet tomorrow. Jake's getting suspicious." My heart dropped. What could she possibly mean? I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. 1,000 possibilities ran through my mind, but none of them made sense. Chris and Alyssa didn't have anything to hide, did they? I debated confronting Chris right then and there, but decided against it. Instead, I took a screenshot of the message and sent it to myself. If something was going on, I needed more proof. The next day, I called Jake. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "How's Alyssa been lately? I feel like I haven't seen her much." Jake hesitated. "She's been busy," he said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Oh, no reason," I said quickly. "Just wondering if she mentioned anything about Chris." They'd been texting a lot lately. There was silence on the other end of the line. "What do you mean, a lot?" Jake asked, his tone sharp. "Just little things here and there," I said, trying not to give too much away. "But it feels odd." Jake sighed. "I've noticed it too. She's been acting weird." I didn't want to assume the worst, but now I'm not so sure. We decided to keep an eye on them. Jake agreed to let me know if Alyssa did anything unusual, and I promised to do the same with Chris. It didn't take long for our suspicions to be confirmed. 2 days later, Jake called me, his voice low and urgent. "I just saw Alyssa sneak out of the house," he said. "She told me she was meeting a friend, but I don't buy it. I'm following her now." "Where is she going?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Looks like a hotel," he said grimly. I didn't need to ask who she was meeting. I drove to the hotel, my hands shaking on the wheel. Jake had texted me the room number, and I parked outside, waiting for him to arrive. When he pulled up, we exchanged a brief, tense nod. "You ready?" he asked. "Let's do this," I said, though I wasn't sure if I was ready at all. We walked into the hotel and up to the room. Jake knocked on the door, his jaw clenched. A moment later, Chris opened it. His eyes widened when he saw us. "What are you doing here?" he stammered. Before he could close the door, Jake pushed past him, and I followed. Inside, Alyssa was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Neither of them answered. The silence in the hotel room was deafening. Alyssa sat frozen on the bed, her face pale, and her hands gripping the edges of her skirt. Chris stood by the door, his eyes darting between me and Jake like a trapped animal. "Well," Jake growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Someone better start talking." Chris opened his mouth, but no words came out. Alyssa was the first to crack. "This isn't what it looks like," she blurted out, her voice trembling. I laughed bitterly. "That's funny because it looks exactly like you're sneaking around behind our backs." "It's not an affair," Chris said quickly, holding up his hands. "Oh, really?" I said, glaring at him. "Then what is it, Chris? Because you've been acting shady for weeks, and now I catch you in a hotel room with my best friend." Alyssa stood, her expression hardening. "We were just talking," she said defensively. About work. Work. Jake scoffed. You don't even work in the same industry. Alyssa hesitated, glancing at Chris. Fine, she admitted. It's not about work, but it's not what you think either. Then tell us, I demanded. What the hell is going on? Chris sighed, running a hand through his hair. We were talking about Jake's company, he said finally. Jake's eyes narrowed. My company? Why the hell would you be talking about that? Alyssa crossed her arms, her face now a mask of defiance. Because it's failing, Jake. And you're too proud to admit it. What? Jake said, his voice rising. You've been struggling for months, Alyssa continued. I've seen the numbers, Jake. If you don't do something drastic, you're going to lose everything. I frowned, looking between them. So you've been meeting behind our backs to talk about Jake's business? It's more than that, Chris said reluctantly. Jake turned to him, his fists clenched. Spit it out. Chris took a deep breath. Alyssa came to me with an idea. She wanted to sell the company and split the profits before it went under. What? Jake shouted, his face red with anger. And you agreed to this? I asked Chris, my voice trembling. No, he said quickly. I told her it was risky, but she wouldn't let it go. Alyssa rolled her eyes. Don't act like you weren't on board, Chris. You saw the opportunity to. Jake stared at her, his hands shaking. You were going to sell my company? Without telling me, you weren't doing anything to save it. Alyssa snapped. I was trying to protect us, Jake. To protect our future. By betraying me? He shouted. I stepped between them, trying to make sense of it all. So you two weren't having an affair? No, Chris said firmly. But you were still lying to us, I said, my voice cold. Meeting in secret, making plans behind our backs. How is that any better? The room fell silent again. Jake looked at Alyssa, his jaw tight. I can't believe you do this to me. And I can't believe you let your pride get in the way of saving our family, she shot back. Enough, I said, my voice cutting through their argument. Both of you need to leave. What? Alyssa said, her eyes wide. You heard me, I said. Get out, Jake, and I need to talk. Chris and Alyssa exchanged a glance, then reluctantly grabbed their things and left. As soon as the door closed, Jake sank onto the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. I can't believe this, he said quietly. Neither can I admitted, sitting down next to him. For the next hour, we pieced everything together. Alyssa had been pressuring Chris to help her sell the company, framing it as a way to save Jake from financial ruin. Chris, being spineless as ever, had gone along with it, even if he hadn't fully committed to the plan. Jake was furious, and I couldn't blame him. But there was a part of me that felt relieved. Chris and Alyssa weren't having an affair, but their actions had exposed cracks in both our relationships. Cracks I couldn't ignore anymore. By the time we left the hotel, Jake and I had made a pact. We're going to confront them together, he said. And we're going to get to the bottom of this once and for all. Agreed, I said, though my heart was heavy. I wasn't sure if my marriage could survive this. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Chris or Alyssa manipulate us any longer. The following evening, Jake and I invited Chris and Alyssa to meet us at our house. Jake insisted on a neutral setting, somewhere we'd all feel like we had an equal say, but the tension in the air was anything but neutral. Chris and Alyssa arrived together, which already set me on edge. It felt like they were presenting a united front, even after we'd caught them red-handed. We all sat down in the living room, Jake and I on one couch, Chris and Alyssa on the other. No one spoke at first. It was as if we were all waiting for someone else to break the silence. Finally, Jake leaned forward, his voice low but firm. All right, he said. Start talking. We want the full story. No more half-truths, no more excuses. Chris cleared his throat, avoiding my eyes. I already told you, he said. Alyssa came to me with the idea. She said the company was in trouble, and that selling was the best option. And you just went along with it. I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I wasn't fully on board, Chris said defensively. I told her we needed to think it through, that we couldn't make decisions without involving you too. Oh, please, Alyssa interjected, rolling her eyes. You were more than on board, Chris. Don't act like you weren't. Jake turned to her, his jaw tight. Why go behind my back like this? If you were worried about the company, why not just talk to me? Because you wouldn't listen. Alyssa snapped. Every time I tried to bring up the financials, you brushed me off like I didn't know what I was talking about. Jake stood, his voice rising. So, your solution was to stab me in the back? To scheme with him? He pointed at Chris, who looked like he wanted to melt into the couch. I wasn't stabbing you in the back, Alyssa said, her tone icy. I was trying to fix the mess you made. This isn't fixing anything, I said, standing up as well. All you've done is destroy trust. Between you and Jake. Between me and Chris. How are we supposed to move forward from this? Chris finally spoke, his voice shaky. Look, I messed up. I get that. But it's not like we actually did anything. The company's still yours, Jake. Nothing's changed. That's not the point. Jake shouted. It's not just about the company. It's about trust. You two lied to us, plotted behind our backs, and thought you could get away with it. I crossed my arms, looking at Chris. And you, of all people, you're supposed to be my husband, my partner. How could you do this to me? Chris looked at me, guilt written all over his face. I'm sorry, Grace. I wasn't thinking. I got caught up in it, and I didn't know how to back out. That's your excuse? I said, my voice breaking. You didn't know how to back out? You didn't even try. The room fell silent again. Finally, Jake turned to Alyssa, his expression cold. I don't know if I can forgive this, he said. Alyssa's jaw tightened. I was doing what I thought was best for us, Jake. If you can't see that, then maybe we're both wasting our time. You're damn right we are, Jake said, his voice steady. Chris looked at me, his eyes pleading. Grace, please. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Just tell me what you need. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I needed a husband who had my back, and you've shown me over and over that you're not that man. I turned to Jake. I think we're done here. Jake nodded, standing and grabbing his coat. We've heard enough. As Jake and I walked to the door, Chris called after me. Grace, wait. Don't leave like this. I paused, looking back at him. This isn't just about tonight, Chris. This is about every moment you chose someone else over me. I deserve better. With that, I walked out, leaving Chris and Alyssa behind. Jake and I sat in silence as he drove me home. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of the confrontation. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back to Chris. The days after the confrontation felt surreal. I stayed at a hotel for a while, unsure what to do next. Chris kept calling, leaving voicemails about how he wanted to make things right, but I didn't return his calls. Jake and I stayed in touch, though. At first, it was just about logistics, figuring out what Alyssa and Chris were doing, untangling the mess they'd left behind. But over time, our conversations shifted. We started talking about more personal things. How betrayed we both felt. How we'd spent years ignoring red flags in our relationships. How, deep down, we'd both known something was wrong long before all this happened. One evening, Jake invited me over for dinner. Nothing fancy, he said. Just two people who've had a really crappy few weeks. I hesitated at first. I didn't want to complicate things, but something in his voice made me say yes. When I arrived, he had takeout containers spread out on the table and 2 beers already opened. I figured this was easier than cooking, he said, smiling sheepishly. It's perfect, I said, sitting down. We ate and talked for hours. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Jake didn't try to fix anything or tell me how to feel. He just listened. At one point, he said, I keep asking myself what I did wrong. Like, how did I not see this coming? I've been doing the same thing, I admitted. But it's not our fault, Jake. They made their choices. We just trusted the wrong people. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's hard to let go of the idea of what I thought my life was supposed to be. Me too, I said quietly. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe we're better off starting over. As the weeks went on, Jake and I leaned on each other more and more. He helped me find an apartment, and I helped him sort through the legal mess Alyssa had left behind with his company. Chris tried reaching out a few more times, but I blocked his number. I didn't want to hear his excuses or apologies anymore. One day, Jake asked, Do you think you'll ever talk to him again? I shook my head. There's nothing left to say. One evening, Jake and I went for a walk in the park. The air was cool, and the trees were just starting to change colors. I've been thinking a lot, he said as we strolled along the path. About what? I asked. About how much things have changed, he said. And how, even though it's been awful, I'm glad I've had you to go through it with. I smiled, my cheeks flushing. Me too. We sat on a bench, watching the sunset. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Do you ever think about what comes next? Jake asked. All the time, I said. But for once, I'm not scared of it. He smiled. Me neither. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized something important. Sometimes, the people we think will spend our lives with aren't meant to stay. Sometimes, the life we plan isn't the life we're meant to live. And sometimes, the hardest endings lead to the best beginnings. My husband left for a work retreat and came back with a secret that changed everything. When my husband, Mike, told me he was going on a week-long work retreat, I didn't think much of it. He traveled often for his job, and while I didn't love the time apart, I trusted him. Or at least, I thought I did. The retreat was in another city, somewhere far enough that driving wasn't an option. Mike seemed excited about it, which was unusual. He usually dreaded these corporate team-building trips, but I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was finally getting along with his colleagues. The day he left, he kissed me goodbye, suitcase in hand, and said, I'll call you when I get there. He didn't. At first, I told myself he was probably busy. Maybe his flight was delayed, or his meetings ran late. But as the hours stretched into a full day without a single text or call, I started to worry. I called him. No answer. I texted. Still nothing. By the second day, I was spiraling. This wasn't like Mike. He always kept me updated when he traveled. I reached out to his assistant, Karen, who handled all his scheduling. Hi, Karen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you know if Mike made it to the retreat okay? I haven't heard from him. There was a pause. Retreat, she said, sounding confused. Mike didn't mention any retreat to me. My heart sank. Are you sure? Yes, she said. He's off this week. No meetings, no events, nothing. The conversation ended quickly after that, but my mind was racing. Why would Mike lie about a work retreat? I spent the next few days trying to piece things together. I checked his emails, his calendar, even his credit card statements, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. By the time he finally came home, I was more confused than angry. He walked through the door late at night looking different. His usually sharp suit was wrinkled, and he had a nervous energy about him, like he was hiding something. Hey, he said, avoiding my eyes. Hey, I repeated, crossing my arms. You've been gone for a week, Mike. No calls, no texts. What the hell is going on? I'm sorry, he said quickly. Things got hectic, and I didn't have time to check in. Didn't have time? I snapped. You didn't even tell Karen about this retreat. What's going on, Mike? He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he was going to tell me the truth. But instead, he just said, it was last minute. I didn't want to stress you out. Something felt off, but I didn't have the energy to push him further. At least, not that night. The next morning, Mike seemed back to his usual self, charming, attentive, and acting like nothing had happened. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. That's when I started digging deeper. Over the next few weeks, I paid closer attention to Mike's behavior. He was more secretive than usual, keeping his phone close and locking his laptop whenever I walked into the room. One night, while he was in the shower, I finally gave in to temptation and checked his phone. That's when I found the messages. There weren't many, but they were enough. A string of texts from an unsaved number. I miss you already. Thank you for an amazing week. Can't wait to see you again soon. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The worst part, there were no outgoing messages from Mike. He must have deleted them, but not hers. It was like he wanted to be caught. I confronted him that night. Who is she, Mike? I asked, holding up his phone. His face went pale. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, I said, my voice trembling with rage. I saw the messages. Thank you for an amazing week. Are you kidding me? He opened his mouth to deny it, but I cut him off. Just tell me the truth, I said, because if you don't, I'm done. That's when he cracked. Her name was Tasha, and she wasn't just some random fling. She was someone he'd been seeing for months. Someone he'd met at a conference and had connected with in ways he claimed we hadn't in years. You don't understand, he said, his voice pleading. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing. So the work retreat was just an excuse to be with her? He nodded, his face filled with shame. I thought about everything we'd built together. Our marriage, our home, the plans we made for the future. And then I thought about how easily he'd thrown it all away. Get out, I said, my voice cold. Grace, please, he said. I can fix this. No, I said firmly. You can't? The next few months were a blur of lawyers and paperwork. Mike tried to reconcile more than once, showing up at my apartment with flowers or leaving long, apologetic voicemails. But I was done. One day, as I was packing up the last of my things from our house, I found a note tucked inside one of his desk drawers. It was from Tasha, and it confirmed everything I needed to know. I can't wait for us to finally be together. You deserve someone who really sees you. I laughed bitterly, crumpling the note in my hand. Mike might have thought he was getting a fresh start, but all he'd done was trade one lie for another. Now, months later, I'm finally finding my footing again. I've moved into a new apartment, started therapy, and even picked up a new hobby, something just for me. Mike, last I heard, things with Tasha didn't work out. Turns out, the spark they had wasn't enough to keep their fantasy alive in the real world. And honestly, that's not my problem anymore. I've learned that sometimes the best payback is just moving on and living a life that makes you happy without the people who tried to drag you down.